This story takes place when I was a senior in high school about 6 years ago. I had a group of friends that I used to party with and get in all sorts of crazy situations too. And one night we got invited to a party by a mutual friend. His name was Sam. Sam gave us the address of his friend's house where the party was going to be at. His friend's name was Terry. And so we head to Terry's house, and Sam lets us know that he apparently can't make it to the party after all, but we should still go. Super weird because he's the only one who knows Terry, but okay, whatever. The house is in a not so great but not terrible part of town. We sort of walk up to the house that looks super run down and honestly looked empty too. We're all kind of confused and wondering if it's actually the right house. So a couple of us say, "What the heck," and start walking towards the door. As soon as we walk up to the front, the side door to the garage next to the front door opens, and Terry walks out to greet us. This guy looks at least 30, maybe 40, and he looked like a stereotypical drug user, just like a really sketchy character overall. So a lot of red flags have gone off at this point, but he mentions our friend Sam who invited us, and he lets us in the house. And this is where I really start to question everything. So I'm the first to walk in and see almost no furniture. There's a plastic folding table, a couch from like the 90s, and a tiny old box TV. I think I tried to tell myself that maybe he's just poor. Whatever. We continue walking further into the house. But the main living room is completely empty with an old vintage life sort of size Santa Claus statue in the corner. In the kitchen there's no food and nothing but a foam ice chest cooler on the counter. At this point, all of my friends who are also sketched out jokingly ask him, "Well, what's in the ice chest?" With a straight face, he responds, "Human organs." Now, it's hard to explain, but the way that he said it wasn't funny, and honestly, it was really unsettling. We all try to forget that we're in a strange man's house and try to enjoy hanging out, drinking, smoking, etc. But not even an hour goes by, and all of a sudden we hear banging on the front door. Our strange host Terry rushes in and says, "Well, kids, we got cops." All my friends run out the back door, leaving me and 3 other friends behind to deal with the cops. The police don't really care so much about whether or not we're doing anything illegal, but they're more interested in why we're at this house. Because apparently this was a vacant house, and no one had lived there for months. We all sort of awkwardly tried to explain how we actually had no idea who this Terry guy was, and that we had no idea that we were trespassing. After a lecture from the cops about how we could have gotten murdered, they let us go. We never heard anything about Terry ever again, and Sam never answered any of our questions about him or that night. And to this day, I still don't know who he was or even what his intentions were. As an adult now, I'm very thankful for whoever called the cops that night, because the Lord knows how that night could have actually ended. So years back, I made a late night stop at a local Walmart on my way home from a friend's house. It was in a quiet area, not a lot of people out, and about at nearly 1 a.m. I've lived around there for years and never run into any truly criminal elements there, so I felt safe going to the store alone as a woman in my early 20s. I made eye contact with a teenage girl the second that I walked in the door. She was parked on a bench by the restrooms, hugging a backpack and a small purse, checking her phone with a rather desperate expression on her face. When she looked at me, I could tell that she was on the verge of panicking. After a brief second of staring at me, she went back to checking her phone and making phone calls. At the other end of the bench was a white-haired man in jeans and a t-shirt. If I had to guess, he was probably in his late 50s or early 60s. Altogether, nothing appeared off about him, but what struck me was the fact that he never looked up as I passed. Instead, his eyes were absolutely glued to the teenage girl next to him. Not in a passive way either, but like he was sizing her up for something. She was perched on the edge of the bench, angling herself away from his gaze and leaning away from him. Her body language screamed that she wanted nothing to do with him. And something about him really set off warning bells in my head as I went about grabbing the items that I'd stopped for. So, I'm normally the type of person that mills about stores aimlessly, making a point to wander each aisle just to see what's for sale. That night, however, I felt a pressing need to get in and out of that store as quickly as possible, and something in the back of my head told me to keep an eye on the man on the front bench. I moved my knife from my purse to the front pocket of my jeans, where it would be easily accessible. That's how uneasy I felt too, being in the same building as this guy. And as I purchased my items, I watched the pair on the front bench. But the man had moved halfway across the space between them and was trying to chat with this young woman. She was shaking her head and offering one-word answers, looking like a rabbit about to bolt. As I walked past them again to leave with my purchases, she stopped me and asked if I was headed anywhere close to my old hometown. Apparently, she had been on her way home from a trip with friends or something, and they'd made a stop to grab some drinks and use the restroom. She had gotten separated from the group, and they left her at the store. The store was about a 30-minute drive from my old hometown, and I knew that to get home, she would have to walk several hours along unlit stretches of rural highway. The man sitting next to her continued to leer at her, but refused to look my way. While I would normally have told this girl that I was headed the opposite direction, something in the back of my head told me not to leave her alone with this guy. So I agreed to take her home, and she thanked me profusely and even offered some gas money and a cigarette. I refused both, and I took her home. The logic part of my brain reasoning that this girl weighed maybe 100 pounds and was a full head shorter than I was, so if it actually came down to it, I could probably fight her off. I wasn't stupid either. I texted a few friends to let them know what I was doing, and they were not happy with me. But the girl mentioned her address, and I knew exactly where she was talking about. It was an old, quiet neighborhood where I used to play Little League Baseball down the street and swim in the pool a few blocks away too. Now, during the drive, she had told me that she had just moved to the area with her mum and younger sister from a large city several hours south. She had taken off with a few of her old friends for the weekend, and her mum hadn't expected her back until the following day, so she'd silenced her phone for the night and hadn't picked up when the girls tried to call. Also, I vaguely remember something about her mum having to work early in the morning, and none of the girls' sisters were old enough to have their own phones. Anyway, we arrived at our destination, and the girl gave me a handshake and thanked me repeatedly, asking if there was anything that she could do to repay me. I told her, yeah, do me a favor. Why don't you get better friends? Looking back, though, I have no idea what about the man creeped me out so much, but something about him and the way he was staring at that girl just got my hackles up. I had thought in passing that he might have been waiting for somebody else in the store, or perhaps someone using the nearby restroom, but upon checking out, it struck me that I hadn't seen any other customers there, so he really had no reason to be waiting on that bench. I was still living with my parents at the time, so when I got home, I woke my mum up and told her what happened. She hesitated, and I could see that she did not like the idea of me giving a stranger a ride home, but in the end, she agreed that something had prompted me to take action, and that, who knows, I might have saved that young girl from being harassed or maybe a lot worse. So this took place over a few years in a farmhouse in the desert of Arizona. It was newly developed land. We moved into the place when I was 15. At the time, I was going through a lot emotionally and smoking a fair bit of weed too. And I guess that could explain some of my personal experiences, so I'll try not to dwell on them too much, but here it goes. So the house was set up almost plantation style. It was very wide and narrow, a big wraparound porch and lots of awkward corners. The front room was a tall library with an open balcony to the upstairs, which ran into long skinny bedrooms. My parents' room was closest to the stairs and attached to a nursery with a sliding ensuite door. My brothers, 2 years younger, and my room were at the end of a dark hallway. That side of the house never got sun to it, so it was always bad vibes all around down there. Downstairs, too, there was a really messed up Harry Potter-style closet, a sunken living room, a kitchen in the center of the house, and a sunken playroom for the baby. And everything started the first day that we moved in. So my brother and I were the only ones in the house, just unboxing plates. The place was so empty that everything echoed, and I swear it sounded like a little girl laughed, like a creepy track that you could get off an app or something. Keep in mind that the TVs were not plugged in yet, and we were on an acre of land far away from the dirt road, and my brother was way too stupid to pull a prank like that. But it wasn't just this, too. You see, I started hearing voices at night. This wasn't unusual, too. I honestly used to freak myself out so badly that I think I made up noises to scare myself, maybe? Anyway, my parents had raised me not to talk about things scaring me, to tough it out and be a big girl. It was fine most of the time during the day, and everything always happened at night, but I do remember distinctly when it started messing with me in my bed. In solidarity, my brother and I kept our bedroom doors open for hallway's nightlight, and in case we needed to call for each other too. We had a pretty messed up childhood that might have contributed to all the codependency I'll describe during this, but I was falling asleep, well, not quite out at this point, when I felt the blanket slipping off the bed and reached down to grab it. This was common too. I didn't have a bed frame with a foot, so it kept slipping no matter how I tried to tuck it though. And in classic horror movie fashion, the last time that I pulled it, I felt tension. There was nothing that I could have caught on, mind you. I feel like the second that I went from confused to terrified, it bounced back to me too. I don't know how to explain this well too, but put it this way, I was sure that someone was under the bed, pulling it away from me. Later though, I moved another nightlight into the bedroom. It was a kind of spooky amber orange, and I convinced my parents to let me paint the walls cherry red. Again, I was almost asleep, but not quite there, so I don't think it could have been sleep paralysis. When I heard the carpet sort of rustle and maybe some joints cracking. Whatever it was, it sounded like my mum had come to check on me. I opened my eyes quickly and immediately froze. Now, I don't think I've ever been more scared than this in my life, but there was a woman crawling across my floor from the far side of the room to the foot of my bed. She was pale and stringy-haired, like she was going bald. I couldn't see her face. I don't know how I fell asleep too that night, but I couldn't scream or move. I think she disappeared under my bed at some point. Again, I know that this could all just be a hallucination, but man, did it feel real. Another time, my baby brother was about 7 months old when she started coming out during the day. My mum was a teacher at the time and was able to stay home with us during summer vacation. It was lunchtime and we were watching a movie quietly downstairs while the baby napped. There were noises upstairs, like something dropped to the ground. We listened for a second before my mum ran up. She thought that the baby may have fallen out of the crib. We found the door and found him asleep. But then we noticed that there was some really weird stuff on the floor. And it took us a while to figure out what it was, but it was like drywall or something. There was a crawl space to a small attic where the AC and the insulation could be reached. It was barely big enough to get into and a good 9 feet from the ground. It also had to be pushed up and slid over to open, but there was a visible gap. The carpet was a really ugly dark blue, so we could see white spots all over the ground like something was dragged from one side of the room to where the crib was. It stopped right in front of it too, but my mum checked the closet and called my stepdad. He couldn't leave work, so we stayed downstairs until he got home and checked the crawl space. We never had any animals, and it's really difficult for most things to live in Arizona, so wildlife is pretty rare in that area. But he didn't find anything or any signs of anything living up there. And this happened every other day for like 2 weeks too. We really didn't know what to make of it. My mum even thought that it might have been the AC suctioning the opening up or something. It stopped though eventually, and it never happened again for like 2.5 years. When my baby sister was born and stayed in the same crib, again, it happened on and off for a few weeks and then never again. But the AC never popped that opening open, so we have no idea what was happening. Now, to keep my own solo experiences a little bit more brief, I had a period of 3 months where I straight up didn't sleep pretty much. I actually went a little bit crazy, I think, but every night I felt like my bed was shaking. At the instant that I laid my head down, it would vibrate, the metal frame would sway, and I'd feel like someone was pushing on the mattress between the baseboards or sitting on the corner or something. I had my brother touch the frame one night too to tell me if it was shaking, or was it just in my head. And he said that it wasn't just in my head, but I'm not sure if he was just playing into it or not. Hard to say. I thought I might have been having seizures or something at one point, and I got so frustrated with it that I started sleeping on the couch downstairs with the dog. It was at this point that I started hearing whispers too. Not a noise that sounded odd, but like someone calling my name. And my name has like 3 syllables, so it's not like I misheard it. I would be in my room, door open, doing something at night after my parents went to bed. It was a female voice, but it sounded off. I don't know how to explain it, but the downstairs really scared me after the lights went out, so I never went down, but I did walk to the balcony to look down. Mind you, I never saw anything, but the whispering would always stop when I got close. Then my brother started hearing it too, which really freaked me out. He's kind of weird. His life's dream has been enlisting in the army, so his reaction was always getting his knife and walking right downstairs to confront it. He'd turn on the lights and look around before coming back up. He even slept on my floor a few nights because he was convinced that she wanted me. But we had prior haunting experiences, which led my parents to making jokes that the ghosts follow us. They just didn't pay much attention to it, as this time when it was quiet. Now one night, my parents went out with the babies. My brother and I were in our rooms, doors open as usual, and we started hearing something weird. I thought it was the wind. It got louder too until it was clear that a woman was wailing in our house somewhere. I know it sounds crazy, but it was clear, man. We hid in my room, it was that clear, for what felt like hours, calling my mum. For some reason too, it didn't occur to us to call the police at this point. But eventually, the crying stopped. We hatched a plan to run for the stairs and out the nearest door. All the lights were on in the house, and my brother had his stupid knives like normal. But it was like it knew that we were going to leave. We heard shuffling outside the door and maybe breathing at one point too. It could have just been the air conditioning, but we kind of decided that we were ready to die, unlocked the door, and we just booked it. The crying started again, and this time it was clear that it was in my parents' room. We got out though, and we stood outside the property line for like an hour, waiting for them to come home, watching the house. No one could have gotten out without us seeing it, but we had huge windows lining the upstairs hallway that showed everything with the lights on. My parents, they actually made fun of us and still do about that night. A few other incidences included my brother talking to the man upstairs. He'd stand in front of the balcony and talk up to someone. He told us that the man was hiding in my room. He talked about the man in the window and would ask, "Who's that?" directed at the doors at night. I don't want to talk about all of it, obviously, but there were just so many instances of voices, door slamming, and things being knocked over in my room that I honestly thought that I was losing my mind. And it was at around 18 that I moved out and came back occasionally, usually just to babysit. Apparently, my reluctant believer mother and absolute skeptic stepdad watched a coffee pot jump off the counter at one stage when I was gone. They also were sitting outside having a fire open evening when they saw a figure in the balcony window of their bedroom. It was a tall man, but my stepdad still needed urging to go upstairs. It appeared a second time, closer to where the nursery door was. My mum said that she had terrible dreams about a man in the corner of her room after that. She was present for many of the times that we heard footsteps upstairs too, doors slamming when the AC was off, all that sort of stuff, but she always denied there being anything wrong, which was always weird to me. My parents left town with the kids for a week at one point, and at this point I was 19 and living happily an hour away. My mum begged me to check on my brother and stay a few nights for the weekend. I arrived during the evening after I got off work, and I asked how it had been alone, and he said that he was fine. He just didn't go upstairs at night and minded his own business. He said that if he ignored it and tried not to get scared, then it ignored him. He felt safe with the dog too, and we were watching YouTube and eating when we started hearing a sort of a deep noise. At first I thought it was a bike or one of the small buggies people drove out there, but then I noticed that it was holding a tune. It was humming. The dog had a weird thing about staring into the bathroom if the door was open too, which was scary at night. But this time the door was closed and he still stood up and stared. The noise was so deep, in fact, that it sounded like it couldn't be human, but it was definitely melodic. There was nothing that I could figure out to explain it to, but my brother and I just kind of looked at each other. Then a door slammed upstairs and we decided to just get out and go for a walk at that point. When we got back, I decided that I would sleep in my parents' room. It didn't feel right to stay in the kids' room, but looking back, it would have been the best way to stay close to my brother. I fell asleep that night, surprisingly easy too. I guess about 2 hours passed before my brother slammed the door open. The house smelled like it was burning. Not really like fire smell, but like burning plastic and trash. I was panicked. I was the adult and didn't know what to do. When we checked the house, I turned off the air conditioning thinking that it might be on fire internally. We opened all the windows and eventually fell asleep on the couch downstairs. The next day, the smell was still lingering, but less overwhelming, and the air conditioning was fine when I turned it back on. Like usual, the day was fine, but that next night, my brother and I went on a jack-in-the-box run. It might have taken like 30 minutes, but we arrived home to a mess of blood, vomit, and excrement of some sort. And eventually we figured out that the dog was sick all over the living room. Well, we immediately took him to the emergency vet, certain that he was dying. They checked him for everything that they could, and they gave him a clean bill of health. But when we got home, everything just broke loose. You see, my brother and I were cleaning up the mess with the doors open for airflow, and there was absolutely insane banging noises from upstairs. We hadn't looked up on the way out, and my brother thought that someone must have snuck in and was trashing me upstairs. He went up to check, and I hung downstairs ready to call the police, but nothing happened. Nothing even seemed out of place, which was really weird. We kept cleaning though, but the noise started almost immediately. It kind of sounded like someone was shouting behind a wall of cement. I couldn't tell the gender, but my brother told me that he had been fine until I got there, that I could leave if I wanted. I totally did, and after that, I didn't go back. My parents actually sold the house this year. During the interim of the move, they stayed in an Airbnb. My brother lived really close to his work, so he stayed in the house with the dog for a few weeks. And this story, just on its own, is so weird that I'm still not sure if I believe it. Like I said, he's kind of weird, but not one to embellish, that's for sure. Anyway, he had been hearing the usual things, even his name being called in the night, but ignored it all. His friends had been coming over to keep him company, and the last day that he was supposed to finish moving, he brought a friend. He says that they felt like they were being watched the whole time that they cleared the place out, and his friend left him to lock up. They got into the car facing the house when they noticed the blinds were open, and they were definitely closed on the way out. And his friend claims that he actually saw them open from the side of his eye. My brother then says that there was a woman squatting in front of the downstairs window, close to where he had just left from. She was pale, her nose was sort of hooked, and her hair was black and stringy. Again, It's the classic horror movie ghost, I know, but he said that she had black eyes with visible white dots in the middle, inside-out eyes as he called them, and she was smiling. He says that it took him a good second of shock to realize that she was looking right at him too. He felt sick too, like she could walk right out and get him. Upon seeing this, though, they burned rubber when his friend snapped out of it, and they screamed at each other all the way down the road about what they saw. He called me right after to explain it, but I was with friends and not really willing to listen at the time. What messes me up so much is that my mum thought that he had a psychotic break. He went into his room and cried all night at the Airbnb after it too because, well, nobody really believed him. She thought that something had happened with his girlfriend. My brother is not a crier at all either. I haven't seen him do it since like we were babies basically. But when we got together and talked about it, his eyes teared up then too. He said that he didn't know why, but he just knew that she wanted to kill him. He even drew a picture of her, and it's not great, but it still fills me with this deep foreboding feeling. It took me a little while to realize that I had seen this woman too, just once in my bedroom, almost 5 years ago. Seeing her suddenly made a lot of sense, and I knew that it just didn't feel like a woman, but it definitely felt feminine, if that makes sense. It felt like something pretending to be a woman, maybe? Anyways, this is getting long, so I better stop here, but feel free to offer any of your opinions. My ex brought up this today. We dated all through high school and had a few experiences together even that she recounts as her only paranormal encounters. I would love to still think that this is my own delusions, but it was shared by just too many people to be that, right? I mean, maybe a few things are explainable, but most of it just isn't. It's affected me so deeply that I'm still terrified that if I think too much about her, that she'll follow us a state away now. Oh, and I also forgot to mention that we heard word from neighbors that the previous family had 12 people, Mormons living in the house. We could only fit like 6 into it. But they were really weird apparently, according to multiple families. And they moved in with 5 kids and only left with 4. And we heard that something terrible happened. We have no idea if any of this is true because we couldn't find any documentation, but it is interesting that this is all rumored to have happened. Anyway, that's all I really have for now, and I hope you enjoyed the stories as hard as they are to tell again. I'll also try and answer any questions if you guys want to offer some comments below. Thanks. So, this is the first time I've ever shared something like this on a place like this, though I've always enjoyed listening to stories here. But it started with listening to people saying their near misses with murderers and house invaders. Then it kind of shifted me to listening to more paranormal stuff. I'd always been kind of on the fence about such things. Like, on the one hand, I would be there going, how could something like that exist and people not have definitive proof of it? But on the other hand, I'm not naive enough to think that there aren't some things out there that we don't know about. Besides, how could so many people have records of seeing that same thing when those people had never met? Still though, most of these stories are abroad, mostly America it seemed. Australia rarely seems to pop up in these tales, and outside of stories of yowies, there doesn't seem to be much help for me and what I saw. But anyway, here's what happened. So, I live in a small town inland of the coast of New South Wales. I say in a town, but the house is actually sort of situated a few kilometres out of town. It's the kind of area that you can see your neighbours in the distance, but you would really have to scream to get them to hear you. A few more kilometres up the road, and it turns into solid bush and national park. It's an old dirt road with trees either side, quiet apart from a few dirt bike riders who go there mostly on the weekends, and the occasional lost car, four-wheel drive, or person collecting wood. So for me, it was the perfect place to go and walk my dogs. On the day in question, I was out with my two dogs, a Great Dane and a Husky, and my mum's dog, a Scotty Terrier. My Husky likes to misbehave, so to stop her taking off into the bush at the smell of a kangaroo, she is on an extended leash. My Dane is loyal to the core, so he's off the leash, and so is the Scotty. She can be a pain and run off, but always seems to come back, so I don't really have a problem with her. So, this bush road, it has what are called fire roads. I believe, therefore, if you get caught in the bush in fires, so there are other escape paths, but I'm not 100% sure. These little beat-up paths, though, are like 20 times rougher than the already rough dirt road that I walk along. I was heading back towards home at this stage, when suddenly, all the dogs freeze up. For a moment I thought it must have been a roo or a wallaby or something, and instinctively grabbed my Husky's leash tighter. She always pulled my arm off when she saw or smelt a roo. But they all stood frozen, even my Husky. I could see the fur on my Dane's back on end as they stared ahead towards the fire trail that branched off. For a moment, I thought it must have been a person and they were on edge because they hadn't expected to see someone. But as I actually took the time to look to what the three of them were staring at, I finally saw it. There was a brown-coloured shadow in the thinner area of the trees before the dirt track about 15 metres away. Now, I've walked this road nearly daily, so I knew each log in this area like the back of my hand, and it wasn't something that I had seen before. This was confirmed too when this thing suddenly shot off and moved, and man, it was fast, like abnormally fast. The kind of speed that you would expect for someone on a motorbike, but there was no motor. In fact, despite my straining my ears, I heard no sound whatsoever. No cracking of sticks, no rustling of branches. It just took off into the thicker trees after standing there and watching me for like a good 10 seconds. I was sure that I had to be going mad, but as I looked to the dogs, all their heads were turned, staring in the same direction that this thing had vanished. It took me another good 30 seconds standing listening before I finally managed to move forward towards the spot that this thing had been. I had to pass it to get home, and so as I walked past it, the dogs all began acting so weird. For instance, my normally brave Husky wouldn't go near the spot, kind of sniffing at it from a distance and then pulling ahead. The Dane did a full circle of the spot, going to the furthest point on the other side of the road to it, his tail tucked between his legs, and the Scotty followed him, cowering in his shadow. I had never seen them act like this before. Normally, if there was an animal or a scent, they would all barge each other to sniff at it, but they just wanted nothing to do with this one. If it was a person, my Dane would normally go into defense mode and stand guard, so I really don't know what this was. Walking in this area too, I know the sounds of roos, wallabies, birds, snakes, even feral deer made, but this thing, it moved like it didn't even touch the ground, not a sound. If the dogs had not been there and reacted to the same thing, I would have thought that I was insane or imagining it. But man, the silence of the bush after it, it made me feel so not right. And the whole walk back home too, I just felt like I was being watched. I kept looking back over my shoulder, but we would never see anything, and we never heard anything either. As I left the bushy area, I began to feel more at ease, and the dogs seemed to relax too. Honestly, I don't know what I saw that day. There isn't much on Aussie Paranormal except for yowies and spirits, but this figure, it was too big to be a person. It seemed wide and solid, more like a bear on hind legs kind of build, and it seemed really tall too. I would guess maybe 7 to 8 feet, but clearly there aren't any bears or animals like that in Australia, so what the heck did I see? What did my dog see? It freaked them out like I've never seen, and I haven't seen it on my walks again since then. Then again, I've also made sure to walk with others more often and sort of away from that spot. And while I felt uncomfortable and nervous, I don't know if I was in danger or if whatever it was just curious. I mean, It didn't attack me, though I felt like it followed me for a while. Either way, I certainly won't ever be going there without my dogs, that's for sure. And from now on, I'm going to see if I can take a different route. This all occurred about 5 years ago now. I had a friend in high school who I'll refer to as D, and D and I were very good friends for a long time. I was having home issues at the time and had developed some anxiety due to it, but I was at his house as much as I could, for comfort and whatnot. I never experienced any sort of weird stuff for at least a few months into knowing him, but as time progressed, that all changed, and progressively things got just worse and worse. I refuse to go over to his house now too, and our friendship has drifted due to this. Keep this in mind too. I don't believe that there was a ghost in his house. I believe that there was something far more dark and sinister. So, I want to elaborate on why I think that something of that nature would be attracted to Dee's house, and why it would try to harm me. So a bit of background about Dee and his family, that I personally think attributed to whatever haunted his house, or rather haunted me. They were absolute slobs. I mean, their house was filthy and disgusting beyond belief. And the more I got to know Dee and his family, the more I realized how negative they all were. Especially Dee, who I was best friends with at this time. His dad was an addict, and so was Dee. An addict to weed, alcohol, food, smoking, anything, it didn't matter. They just lacked any semblance of self-control pretty much. And this, I believe, was the main cause of it all. You see, I got Dee into PC gaming, and let's just say that he isn't too clever with his browsing history, and I accidentally stumbled onto some particular taste that he has, a very odd, specific taste. I won't disclose what it was, but know that it was definitely something that would attract evil, if you believe in that sort of thing. I'm no prude by any means, so trust me when I say I doubt that this taste is anything that you've ever looked up at night. Anyway, I started to realize over the months that we were spending together pretty much every day, that Dee was a dark person, full of jealousy, hatred, selfishness, and objectively speaking, just a really dumb person. He didn't really try to hide his vices too. But I found a lot of disturbing things in his room and in closets in his house as well. I obviously kept everything to myself, and he ended up telling me about his problems with his tastes years later. And we both experienced a paranormal event that night, but that's a long and an entirely different story, which I'll get to another time maybe. But for now, I think it's important to note that I was raised Christian, hold Christian beliefs, but am generally a bad Christian, and have struggled with my faith and following what I believe for years. And this hypocritical conviction, I believe, played a significant role in my haunting. His family attended a cultish church that partakes in holy laughter and speaking in tongues, all that stuff, something I was raised to believe was false and wrong. Whatever was haunting that house only haunted me as well, and still to this day, Dee and his family either think that I made everything up, or they just don't care. I don't know which is true, but to be honest, it doesn't matter, I suppose. Anyway, I'll begin with the first experience. So this must have been maybe around 6 months into being there every day, but it might have been sooner. But I started keeping my gaming PC at Dee's house after knowing each other for a few months, and this came after some other stuff at home happened, and when Dee wasn't home, I would hang out there alone and chill after school. I mean, I practically lived at this place. But I kept all my stuff in his small guest bedroom, which shared a wall with Dee's room. And the first experience I had, I was playing CSGO and heard what sounded like footsteps directly above my head. To give context to people who don't know what CSGO is, it's basically a competitive game that requires a lot of focus, so even though I could hear these sounds above my head, I pretty much just ignored them. And it was the first time that I would hear these footsteps that would become all too familiar. The footsteps always sounded like heavy boots as well, like pirate boots on a boat that you'd hear in something like Pirates of the Caribbean. Dramatic, large thuds with each step. sounds persisted for at least 10 minutes off and on, before abruptly stopping, which was immediately followed by the closet door. A thin, sliding plywood door an arm's length away, being hit from the inside extremely hard. Imagine a small child were to run into a door. It was that loud. The desk my monitor was on shook, in fact, and I was just baffled and stuck in my chair from pure fear. I stared at this sliding door, waiting for it to open, but it became quiet instead. No footsteps, no banging, nothing. Just a really weird, eerie silence. It scared me to the point, too, where I just sprinted out of the room and to the front of his house, where I stayed until Dee got home. I told him what happened, and he didn't think much of it. We went into the room, and he slid open the door, but, of course, there was nothing. I searched the whole closet. There were no holes that rats could have come out of, only a few empty cardboard boxes, and, man, I searched everywhere, but there was nothing. But from this point on, it became a bit of a norm for me to hear footsteps directly above my head, but only whenever I was there alone. And the footsteps, they would follow me throughout the house too. And occasionally I would stop, and they would stop, like right above my head. And if I stayed still long enough, they would then begin stomping. I can't emphasize enough just how much they matched my movement too. And this may sound odd, but they sort of reacted to my thoughts, I think. Like, I would think to myself, okay, I'm going to move in 3, 2, 1. Then, before I actually move, the footsteps would stomp around and walk in circles. It was horrifying, honestly, and I seriously could not explain it to myself. This was obviously disturbing me, but I really didn't have anywhere else to go, so I just tried to ignore it and chalked it up to rats or something. This phenomenon, though, it would happen every few days when I was alone in the house, and each time it would terrify me, and it made me feel so alone. Fast forward a year maybe, though. I'm lying in bed. It's Saturday morning, and I'm there in the house alone in the guest room. Dee is at work. His parents aren't home. It's 11 a.m., and I'm scrolling mindlessly on my phone. Breaking the dead silence instantly, though, I hear footsteps in the attic. But this time, running from across the house, very aggressively, to exactly over my head. I remember it vividly, too. The running stopped right over my head, and I just sort of laid there in fear and in silence looking up at the ceiling. The footsteps, they seemed like they were angry. I know, it's weird saying that footsteps can be angry, but that's the best way I can describe it. And for the first time, I actually felt a presence. I know, it's hard to explain, but imagine your eyes are closed and someone gets very close to your face, and even though you can't see or hear them, you can definitely sense that they're there. And that's how it began to feel with this thing, whatever it was. I would sort of sense it before I heard it, and I became very acute to its presence over the years as well. In any case, it was a good 2 minutes before I went to get out of the bed, and then, exactly as I had mentioned with the footsteps to the thought of myself moving, a loud crash directly above me, right where I was looking, straight into the ceiling from the attic. And it was as if you were like deadlifting 150 pounds and then just threw it onto the ground as hard as you could. And at that, I immediately sprinted out of the house again, except this time, I actually walked home because, well, I knew that it was going to be hours before anyone was home. And this is where I started actually dreading sleeping at this house. I mean, what is in this attic? I became sort of obsessed with that question. I told Dee this, and he nonchalantly wrote it off as an animal, but as much as I explained it to him that it reacted to my thoughts, he just didn't think much of it. Anyway, a few days after this, we were in the garage where there's an entryway into his attic. I convinced him to get a ladder and see what we can find in there. I went up first and shined a light deep into the darkness of the room. I couldn't see anything, and no amount of money on earth was going to compel me to enter that room, that was for sure. But something about it was just wrong. I saw, however, a box, a black box. It was in the back right corner of the attic, right above the guest room, and I could only guess that this was the box that was dropped over my head a few days previous. I had Dee look, and he saw it as well. In hindsight, I sort of wish we had gone in and looked at what was in that box. I'll come back to this later though, but at this point I want to clarify that I am completely stable, have no history of schizophrenia or insanity in my family. I'm an extremely rational person, and up until this point, had no interest or belief in spirits or ghosts or demons. And I want to preface this because things get a little bit crazy after this. So Dee had a dog who I'll refer to as P. P and I were pretty much best friends. He was truly an extraordinary dog too. I loved him with all my heart, and he comforted me in my lowest moments since life was hard then, and I never really opened up to anyone. And when I experienced all these things happening to me, P was there for me, so when I say alone, I really wasn't completely alone, I suppose. In fact, I think if P wasn't there, I probably would not have been able to endure it. He was with me every single time that I'd walk to get water or go to the bathroom, make food, and the loud horrifying footsteps would come back instantly over my head. It was basically a jump scare that could come randomly, and it made me very paranoid and hesitant to move around in the house, to be honest. Whatever it was an abusive thing that enjoyed sort of taunting me and toying with me, I suppose. But Dee and his family left for a week to go on vacation at one point and asked me to take care of P. At this point in time, I had 2 computers. I kept one at Dee's house and one at my own, and things had subsided a bit at my house, so I didn't spend every night at Dee's house anymore. But I went over to Dee's house pretty much every day and played with P and fed him and whatnot. I would hang out there for a few hours and then I would head home. Now, 3 days after Dee's family left, I walk into their house and P is just sort of freaking out, barking at something in the middle of his living room. I try to calm him down, but he just won't. He's gnarling and barking as if something was in the middle of the living room. And finally, after what seemed like 5 or 10 minutes, I would guess, he relaxes a bit, still on guard though, and follows me to his food bowl, and then into the guest room where I played some games. There were no footsteps though, or presence that I was now very sensitive to be felt or heard, which was a rarity, I'll admit. I leave, and the next day I come over to the same thing. P is freaking out, this time way more aggressively too. He's moving around the living room, but his gaze and posture is poised around the center of this room as he moves around it. But this time, I definitely feel the presence, and as I watch P bark and whimper and freak out, I sort of stand still and try and listen. I listened for at least 5 minutes, and I swear I didn't move a single muscle. But P eventually calmed down and looked at me as if he knew I was just standing there listening, and he knew that I knew that there was something there. Finally, though, I think, alright, well, I don't hear anything. Maybe P is just upset that Dee and his family are gone? This is the first time they left since I had known them, and they spent a lot of time in the living room together. And as I barely moved, like even a centimeter, there were like massive booms right above my head. I must have jumped at least 5 foot in the air too, but stomping and jumping and clawing on the floor above my head, P starts freaking out and starts to almost attack the air in the middle of the living room, biting and gnashing his teeth. I am thoroughly freaked out, so I just run over to P's food bowl, pour in a lot of food, and I just bail out of that house. And it was around this time that I realized that I really just do not ever want to be in that house again, alone or not. The next 2 or 3 days I go over there. P is still freaked out, but no barking or anything related to the living room, and I just quickly fed him and then I left. But on the last day before Dee and his family came home, something happened. I enter the door and immediately I feel this presence. It's almost as if the air itself gets sort of humid and thick. I'm on guard and P is sort of crying this time though. I mean, he's literally crying and jumping on me and whimpering as I enter the door. I take one step into the room, and there's a loud footstep right above me. The first step I took into the house, I had gotten almost annoyed with this thing at this point. It was the first step that I took into this house as well, which sort of surprised me a bit. It surprised me a bit too, because normally it sort of takes a minute or two, but this time it was right off the bat. I had gotten almost annoyed with this thing at this point too. I didn't want to bother to stop and listen too, so I just headed straight to P's food bowl. I walk over to the side room where it's kept, and it's missing. The food bag, which is heavy and zipped, is still sitting there obviously, but the bowl is missing. I looked around, and as I walk around the house, I hear the footsteps following me in the attic above my head like normal. P is whimpering and every few seconds barking. I walk back out to the living room, and what I saw next literally has changed my life ever since. P's food bowl is sitting directly in the middle of this living room, right where P had been barking and attacking the air a few days prior. Not only this, it was completely full of food. In fact, it was now overflowing with food, as if it was a message. I knew why you were coming here. I remember walking backwards slowly out of the house at this, just sort of stunned. I honestly just barely could believe my own eyes. I shut the door and I got into my car. I forgot to mention too that I drove over with my girlfriend, and it was late. She knew about Dee's house and the things that I'd experienced there, so she came to sort of give me, I don't know, some confidence. But she said that when I got out to the car that I was as white as a ghost, and apparently even had tears streaming down my face. Before I even said a word though, I had the car pulling out of the driveway. She frantically was asking me what happened, and it was at this moment that I decided that I would never go to this house alone, ever again. Dee and his family came back, and I told them what happened. His mum looked at me like I was a joke, and she half listened to me and sort of half listened to the TV show that she was watching. I told his dad that maybe a homeless person was living in the attic and that he has to look in there. And to my surprise, he finally accepted, and he and Dee and I walked into the garage with a ladder, and his dad peered into the attic with a flashlight. He said that there was nothing in here, and I said, look into the back right corner. There's a black box there. No, there's not. Dee and I sort of looked at each other. And for the first time ever, I actually think Dee was finally a bit scared, because he definitely saw that black box himself. Dee and I told his dad about the box. I told him that it was thrown at the ceiling floor when I was in the house alone one time. But he didn't care. He just simply shut the attic door, climbed down the stairs, and put the ladder back. I told Dee that I was done sleeping at his house at this point, and I was done staying here at all, period. I told him that if he wants to come over to my house, then that's fine, but I was going to take my computer home, and that was that. He was really angry about it, but I told him that over the years he never took me seriously, and things were going on in this house and I was done. It simply was just too scary for me to be there, and after spending so much time there and enduring a lot of hardships in my own personal life, I associated the horror of that house with the anxieties and worries of my own life too. Leaving that house for good too was a life-changing decision for me. I don't know why those things happened to me, but in a weird way it made me a stronger person, I guess, because I had to decide that I was done, and I didn't care how I made Dee feel. I know that sounds selfish, and maybe it is, but my whole life I never cared about myself first, and this was the first time that I ever did. I have been back over there since I vowed to never go back over again, and in the short times that I go over, I still feel a presence there. But Dee was a good friend, I suppose, and he struggles with a lot of his own demons, so when he begs me to come over for a few hours, I often do. I tried to spend the night there one more time, and the sliding closet door was ran into again like the first time as I was falling asleep, and this completely solidified my decision to never stay there ever again. But I learned things about Dee after all this went down that made a lot of the evil in the house make a lot more sense. D, he was a really disturbed and confused person, and his family has a history of really disturbing and sinister events too. Whatever is in his house has forever changed my life and my views on things that are just unexplainable. I used to live in Indonesia before migrating to the States, and I remember this one thing that really scared me back then. I was probably 7 or 8 years old about that time, so I guess I can't blame myself if it was just my overactive mind, and I was just scaring myself maybe, but I don't think I was. In either case, here's the story. So, we had a stay-at-home maid at the time, which I think is a pretty common thing in there. My mum would hire some random maid and they would live at our house and get paid until they leave for many reasons. We had a couple of them over the span of me growing up, but this one maid is the reason why I'm writing this. So my family loved her because she was just overall a really good person and helped my mum with daily tasks a lot. One of those tasks being to wake me up for school on school days, and usually I'd wake up to her calling my name a couple of times and then I would get ready. But this one day I woke up to her voice, like she was having a conversation with someone, but it was just her voice. I don't know what she was saying since I just woke up, but I know that she was calling my name, and the thing that scared me was when I opened my eyes, I saw that she had her back turned towards me facing the wall. She kept talking to the wall until I called for her, and then she turned around and acted as if I didn't just see her talking to a wall. She then got me ready for school, and when I asked her who she was talking to, she said that it was nothing and that she was singing or something like that. I don't remember if I believed her at that time, but I do know that same night, I couldn't fall asleep because I was so scared, and it didn't help that my bed position makes me face the same wall. So I told my mum, but she was a Christian and told me to pray and just sleep. That instance only happened once though, and I've never woken up to my maid talking to the wall again. Anyway, it was a weird situation and I sort of put it to the back of my mind, and eventually that maid left because of family reasons not too long after, so my mum had to hire a new one. But it wasn't even that long before the new maid left, and I overheard her pleading with my mum one time to let her go because she was so scared of living in our house. She said that when she tries to sleep, she would hear whispers next to her. Her door would swing wide open by itself sometimes when she was in the room, or she would hear someone knock her door at times where we'd all be fast asleep already. But the thing that scared me the most from her experience is when we left her to guard the house alone while my family went to the market to get groceries one time. She said that she kept hearing a lady's voice or something that sounded like my mum coming from our room upstairs while she watches TV downstairs. This reminded me of the last maid that we had when she was talking to the wall, and this got me sort of shaking a bit. I don't remember sleeping with the lights off ever again after that. Even up until this day, I still leave the lights on. Anyways, I think my mum got concerned for that maid at that time because she was hysterically crying while telling her all those stories, so she let her go back to her family. Nothing strange happened again with the maids after her, but I developed a thing where I prayed every night before I slept since I was scared. It was a terrible time though, and one full of fear for me. And I still get chills just thinking about it. So at 6 a.m, I get a morning call from work. It's a hospital, so they screen us by phone before coming in, and I'm like, whatever. Alarm is for 6:30 a.m, I can't really sleep. I'm just sort of browsing my phone in an otherwise dark room, pitch dark outside. And then I hear 4 very distinct taps on the window frame above my head, and my heart stops. I live in a nice neighborhood, the first floor in a house. The window is to my backyard where a very squeaky gate exists and a fence is blocking it. And then another set of tapping a few seconds later in a calm and steady set of 3. Well, I freeze at this. Another set of 3. I turn on my bedside lamp. A set of 2 taps follows. I can't see out the window at all. The blinds were closed, and there was a very small gap between them, but honestly, I was sort of in shock. Another set of taps a few seconds later, 2 or 3. One more time, and maybe a set of 4 that time. I cannot move, and then the gate quietly scraped and the tapping stops. I'm a very light sleeper, and the gate is loud. I would have heard someone get in. I inspected, and I found nothing outside of the norm. I mean, why would they tap when they could see the light of my phone, and after I turned the light on and all that? There's no trees out the window, and the taps were nothing like a bird or a bug. But anyway, my priority was to make sure that nobody was studying my routine or planning to rob me or murder me, so I set up a somewhat ridiculous homemade noise trap that would wake the neighborhood, and also set up a phone in the closet window with a sleep recorder to document and hopefully spook any mischief. But what I found the next morning, I cannot explain. So I went to sleep and lights out at exactly 11:30. Uneventful night, and I wake up, I shower, I check the sleep recorder, and it made my heart sink because you can clearly hear bottles breaking, which is the trap that I set up. Nobody else is awake or moving in the house. My neighbors are old and definitely were asleep, and they're always absolutely quiet as well. The first part of the clip is clearly something glass falling and crashing as well, of that I'm sure. So I sheepishly go outside to inspect the aftermath of the broken bottles, and to my surprise, nothing has changed. The bottles are exactly where I left them, and the entire exterior and interior of the house is completely unremarkable. I mean, sure, someone could have set the bottles back up and jumped the fence, I suppose, but the sleep recorder didn't pick anything else up that was unusual the rest of the night. I just set up a night vision camera as well, and here's to hoping that this mystery is definitely solved tonight. I'll keep you guys updated if I find anything. You know those things that you grow up thinking are pretty ordinary, scary stuff that everyone at one point encounters? Sort of like almost getting into a bad accident or something? Well, that was how I felt about almost getting abducted from my front yard. It wasn't until college, when I'd casually mentioned this incident, that I fully processed the magnitude of what just happened. Maybe that's why to this day that I'm so paranoid. But what gets me the most is how truly random these acts are, and how many different circumstances have to fall into place for such events to happen. For one, it was not raining, which for Portland, Oregon is near miraculous when it's not the summer. In fact, it was a gorgeous day outside with clear skies. Second, my mum was home. Growing up at the time with a live-in nanny due to my dad's travels and my mum constantly being on call at the clinic, a true parental supervision was pretty much a rarity. And so these factors united when my mum locked the TV room and told my sister, age 5, and me, age 7, that we needed to spend more time outside. We had a yard for a reason, she said. And so we went out to our front yard, which, for context, was slanted steeply. There were about 40 steps to get from our gate by the street, and my sister and I situated ourselves on the grass about halfway down the steps from the house with our American Girl dolls in tow. We lived on a quiet side street in a safe suburban-esque area of Portland, the West Hills for those who are familiar. The biggest incidences typically involved a drunk teenager crashing into a neighbor's car or something. Crime never really happened here. Hence, my extremely type A and overprotective mum, scared by all the things that could go wrong with her patients, treated her children with an impressive amount of paranoia. However, even she felt comfortable leaving us outside unsupervised. Now, while playing, an unusual-looking pickup truck caught the side of my eye. It was vintage-looking and light green. Then, suddenly, the truck slowed down as it neared our house and came to a near stop by our yard. Since it was on the opposite side of the street, the driver then did an illegal U-turn in the middle of the street and maneuvered his truck so that it was directly adjacent to our yard. Even then, I didn't think anything of it. It's Portland. Even by that age, I'd met a cast of characters. However, the hair went up on the back of my neck as he stepped out of the car and stood directly outside of our gate. He yelled to us, asking for help and telling us to come down. His dog was sick, he said. and if we came down, that he had some candy for us. My sister, forever a sugar fiend, started to get up excitedly. The man slowly opened our gate, anticipating us, and I had a sickening feeling about him and grabbed my sister's hand. "He's a bad guy. Go inside," I told her, and we screamed and ran inside, quickly locking the door. My mum came to the door to see what the commotion was, but by the time that she looked outside, the car was gone. She stopped pushing us to go outside after that, though, which was a blessing. A final circumstance I should mention, too, was that just a few weeks prior, in my first grade classroom, we had our first stranger danger talk, where they show you the black and white photos of scenarios and tell you how to react. And they had told us about predators' tactics, such as asking for help, offering candy, or mentioning animals. Verbatim, I was warned about those tactics, and lo and behold, this aspiring child abductor tried it on me just a few weeks later. And I think that we were fortunate that he wasn't very creative. So I'm 23 right now, and this must have happened when I was 10 or 12, I think. My cousin came to visit me during the summer. I live in a small town, and at the time, there probably wasn't even 2,000 people living there. I may not know everyone, but I do know quite a few people in my subdivision. Enough to know that most of them are elderly or parents with kids. So this made what had happened that much more strange. So one day, I was just looking for my cat. She's allowed to go out, which has never been a problem, other than one time she ran away for a whole week, and ever since then she's always had a curfew. 9 p.m. just before dusk, in my backyard, there's a football field and the bush, and just more of a reason to have her inside at night. It was getting late, and she still hadn't come in, so, of course at the time, me not really paying attention because I was visiting with my cousin. But before I knew it, it was passing midnight, and we were heading to bed. I noticed, too, that I hadn't seen my cat, and I started to freak out. I looked everywhere in the house and shaken her treats, but there was nothing. I decided to try around the house outside, and still I couldn't find her. I went inside to tell my cousin that I was going to walk up the street and see that maybe she was in someone's yard or something. I live on one end of the streets of the subdivision, so there's a curve at the beginning of my street, and as I made my way up the street, I was calling my cat's name out and checking yards as I went along. It was past midnight now, so I didn't expect anyone to be out. But there was this man, and he was standing at the end of the Louis Street, which is only the second street after mine. He was just standing there, back facing me on the other side of where the street light is, so I couldn't really see much of him. Quite honestly as well, I didn't think too much of it because, well, I was preoccupied looking for my cat. But then I noticed that he turned and faced right, like completely turned his body to the right, and then straight ahead, and then to the left. As I was seeing this, I was kind of confused, thinking, what is this guy doing? Is he looking for something? And then he turned and faced my direction, and he started walking, which again didn't startle me too much, until I realized that he had noticed me and was now running. This full-grown man started full-on sprinting straight towards me. I was so scared that I ran as fast as I could, and I could hear his footsteps getting louder and closer. I was only 4 houses away from my own house, thank God, so it didn't take long for me to get there, but as soon as I got in, I slammed my door and locked it. And just as I did, staring at the door window, heart racing, I didn't see anyone out there. Relieved that I hadn't seen anyone, but sort of curious and confused, wondering where the man could have gone, I went to the living room to look out the big window that oversees the whole street, basically all of it anyway, and there was nothing. No one. That was weird as well because, well, there's just no way he could have really gone anywhere that fast. I mean, I should have seen it. To boot as well, my cat was inside the whole time when I came in. I really have no idea how, who, or where this man even came from, or went, but I was just looking for my cat. Growing up in 2005, on the edge of the suburbs, there was a large grove of trees and hills by some railroad tracks that led to a big forest about a half a mile from my house. When I was 9 years old, me and my neighborhood friends would ride our bikes to the railroad tracks and walk to the forest to go and explore the random pieces of furniture and junk in this really peculiar forest. We'd play card games, do homework, and just sort of hang out with friends out there for about maybe an hour or two at a time. But we never sat out there for too long. There were these small abandoned houses here and there as well in this forest that we stayed away from. As one neighborhood friend, Michael, told me there was a homeless man who lived in one of them, and if you saw him, to run. So, right off the bat, after hearing this, going near this house in the woods was pretty scary as could be. But one chilly November afternoon after school, I came home and dropped off my backpack at my house and immediately went to the woods. My bike was actually broken, so I walked that day. Michael had told me at school that day to meet him in this open area of the forest to play Pokemon with him. This was something that we'd frequently do growing up, just to pass the time until our parents got home at like 4 o'clock, so it was nothing unusual. As I crossed the railroad tracks into the forest, I instantly just sort of felt a weird sensation. It was that feeling that you feel when someone's watching you. I looked around and I couldn't see anyone, so I thought that I was just getting spooked, as the rather overcast day was pretty eerie anyway. Trekking through the autumn leaves scattered across this large wooded area, I came upon the big open area where I was supposed to meet Michael. Near the area where we normally met was his notebook open, and on the page was written, "Hey, I had to go back home and grab some batteries from my Game Boy. Wait for me here. I'll be back soon. Michael." So I sat there and I waited. Being alone, especially when you feel like somebody is watching you, made this particular moment very uncomfortable for me. However, I convinced myself that I was just being a big wuss and decided to just wait for Michael. I sat down and I began playing my Game Boy. And it wasn't too long until that sensation of being watched grew into just complete paranoia. I kept frantically looking up from my Game Boy and checking my watch to see how long I'd been waiting. I'd been sitting there for 30 minutes now, and it was actually beginning to get dark. Then I heard some leaves crunch. I looked in the direction of the sound, and I briefly saw a dark hooded figure peeking from behind a few trees and hide back behind them. My skin crawled, and I immediately jumped up from where I was sitting and froze in my tracks, staring. I said, "Hello?" to see if anybody was there. I was quickly reminded, too, that I wasn't alone when I saw this tall, dirty-looking hooded man peek back around from the trees, and he called back, "Hey, buddy." And at that, I picked up Michael's notebook and ran for my life. I ran so fast that I barely had time to look behind me. However, I did hear leaves crunching not too far behind me because it was the man running after me. He was screaming for me to come back, and "I just wanted to talk to you and I'm sorry." I began crying as I was running, thinking that this was exactly how those missing kids disappear. I ran and I ran and I ran until I literally tripped over the railroad tracks and cut my knees up. Michael was actually just getting to the railroad tracks as well. He saw me, dirty and bloody and crying hysterically, and I screamed at him to run. Without question, we ran all the way home together. The hooded man was nowhere to be seen once we left the railroad tracks, thankfully, and I last saw him standing in the woods, defeated that he couldn't quite catch me or something. I don't know. Afterwards, I told Michael everything, and we never went back to the woods ever again after that. Years later, though, in 2016, they actually bulldozed the woods and built a neighborhood there. We later found out from fellow neighborhood friends who were in the area as well, that the same thing had happened to them growing up. And to this day, this is probably one of the scariest stories that I have while growing up. When I was around 11, I have this memory of me trying to sleep in my room and having an encounter with a strange thing. I slept in a bunk bed with my brother on the top bunk, and one night, when it was still a little after we got to bed, I felt just a bit off. When this happened, my brother was already asleep, and this happened whenever Five Nights at Freddy's was pretty big, and I was getting scared and sleeping with my blanket over my head. But I was laying there, and I saw something in the corner of my eye, and I put my covers over my head, and I heard something move, and felt something above me. It felt like some kind of a large animal maybe on all fours above me, but not touching me. I thought it was just my imagination, to be honest, and I said hello fairly loudly to try and see if my brother was still awake or trying to wake him up. I mean, maybe it was him. But it was quiet for a bit, and then I heard from directly above me, "Hi," and the voice was really quiet and seemed to sort of drag a bit, and definitely did not sound like my brother. I stayed under my covers, and I just practically shook there for the rest of the night, and eventually I got up when the sun was coming up. The only description that I can give for its appearance, though, is that it was completely black and large, but smaller than a human. And if you guys have any ideas of what could have happened besides just my imagination, then I'm all ears. So we used to live in a cul-de-sac in a brand new housing estate. Plenty of houses, but very little people yet. And when I say brand new, it still wasn't even on the GPS yet. I work from home, so I'm in my office with my dog by my door in the middle of the day. And my wooden front door is open, but my screen door is locked. And I hear the door handle click, and suddenly my dog starts going off like I've never heard before. This isn't a little yapper too. She's a trained personal protection dog. We don't have guns or pepper spray as protection in Australia, so I got her. I step out of my office and I look towards the front door, and there's a man standing there completely silent. Now that I've stepped out of my office and given the vibe that I'm uncomfortable, my dog proceeds to slam herself against the screen door trying to get through to rip this bloke's face off. And she is trained to protect, but she frightened me in that moment. I've never seen her so angry and vicious before. All the while, this man is just standing there, calm, and smiling this creepy smile. Not at all fazed by this dog behind the door, just wanting to rip him apart. We're standing there for a good 30 seconds while I wait for him to say something, but he doesn't. So I call my dog back and ask him what he wants in a sort of annoyed manner because, what the heck, right? He tells me, "You need to open this door so I can give you this flyer. I work for a new solar company." Keep in mind, this bloke is alone, not wearing any uniform and has no form of visible ID. He does, however, have duct tape sticking out of his pocket. I respond with, no, my dog's gonna rip your face off, man. Plus, I'm not interested." He responds, "I'm not scared of the dog," still smiling wide and creepy. At this point, my dog refuses to respond to my commands and is now slamming her body against the door while barking and growling in an absolutely frightening manner. She's frothing at the mouth and everything, and I'm certain she has doubled her size. Remember, she is a well-trained protection dog. She's always heeded my commands, and I've never seen her act like this before. But he doesn't move. I can see that he's beginning to grow impatient, though. He says, "Open the door." I reply with "No, put it in the letterbox." At this point, I see my next-door neighbor returning home. And then he smiles, turns around, and just walks off. Doesn't put anything in the letterbox and doesn't say another word. I watch him walk right by my neighbor, no talking to them, nothing in the letterbox, turns up the pathway and just disappears down the lane. My dog huffs and then goes back to her previous spot that she was sleeping before. It should be noted as well that my driveway was gravel at the time. Him walking up it should have made some sound, but not myself and not my dog realized that he was there until he tried opening the door. Always lock your door, folks. I definitely escaped something that day, and we don't live there anymore. When I was about 15 years old, I got this phone call in the middle of the night that still sticks with me to this day. So it was around 3 in the morning on a school night when I woke up to a phone call. I was wondering who the heck would be calling me this late, but it was from an unknown number. I answered the phone, and there was a lot of wind on the other end, like the person was running. They were screaming my name over and over again. They were terrified, like they were being chased or something. My parents had divorced, and at the time my mum was working 3 jobs, including one at a casino. And my first thought was someone was attacking her while she was walking out to her car. I screamed, "Mum," 3 times, but the only thing that I heard was this person just screaming my name, and then the call just dropped. At this point, I'm in tears because I think my mum is getting brutally murdered, so I run upstairs to wake my dad up and tell him what's going on. He somehow manages to calm me down and tells me that he'll call my mum's sister. The next day at school, I go to everyone that I know asking if they prank called me last night. No one admitted it, and honestly, no one even seemed suspicious. I had a feeling, though, that something more sinister was going on since the person on the other end was literally screaming at the top of their lungs, and when I get home, my dad tells me that he got a hold of my aunt and that my mum was okay. And I just couldn't figure out what had happened. Another weird thing about this, though, was that the call felt like it only lasted a few minutes, but the call log said that it lasted a little over 10 minutes. Anyway, that night I'm getting ready for bed, and my dad pokes his head in my room to tell me that my great-grandma passed away last night, right around the time that I got that phone call. I never did meet my great-grandma before, but apparently she was a very nice woman. Some family members would describe her as straight up nasty, but I don't know. I honestly think that I got a call from my great-grandma after she died, as she was being dragged away to the afterlife. So during college, 3 friends and I went up to a family cabin that we had access to. It was always kind of fun when there was fresh snow on the ground and a full moon. You could see just like it was daylight almost and walk into the hills to the old Chicago mine. So what we would always do was go out shooting. We had a few guns, a shotgun, pistols and a rifle, so we always felt pretty safe. After we dropped off our non-essentials in the cabin, we set out for the mine. So when you walk out the front of the cabin, you can actually go across the open area in the trees, and there's one perfect little spot to cross the creek, but it was just where we were reaching the creek that we heard this strange ringing noise, sort of like 3 bongs. It was faint, and we were trying to figure out where it was coming from as we proceeded up towards the mine. But the closer that we got to the mine, the louder this ringing sound sort of became. As we followed the trail round a winding hillside, this sound just got louder and louder, and as we rounded the corner to the collapsed entrance of the mine, the sound just suddenly stopped. What's left of the mine is a small tunnel about the size of maybe a conference room with a caved-in entrance. We pointed our flashlight into the mine entrance, but it looked like it always did. We hiked a bit further to the mine's glory hole. This is where, in the old days, miners would dig straight down until they found an ore vein. Then they would follow the vein deeper into the earth. So this is basically a black hole leading straight down into the hill below us. We hiked up to the top of the hill, where there was a large fence up to keep people and animals from falling into the pit, as it was still quite deep and fairly large around, and if you fell in, getting out was a big problem, and you could also get seriously hurt, obviously. When all 4 of us got up there, though, we suddenly started to hear this ringing bong sound again, louder than ever this time. So we beat feet back down to the mine entrance, but as soon as we got there, the sound stopped. We sat there staring at the entrance for a minute when suddenly one of my friends let off a round into the mine. And as soon as that round went off, we saw this very faint, tiny glow, and I mean it was tiny. It looked like it was coming from deep, deep in the mine. We shone our flashlights in, and it would always just disappear. We turned them on and off to look for glints or reflections, but this light just sort of stayed there, if our lights were off, that is. Then, the light began to move, very small, sort of bobbing movements. As the glow bobbed back and forth in small arcs, that little tiny glow slowly begins to get larger. Now, as this light continued to grow larger and larger, bobbing consistently towards us, we realized what it looked like. It looked like someone walking with a headlamp on. Well, we all quickly lost our nerve and we headed back for the cabin. So, in order to get back to the cabin, what we always did was run up the hill, past the glory hole and down a little washout. Then you go over 2 small hills and drop down to the far side of a small lake, across which is our cabin. We then would walk around the lake to a small crossing area and follow the shore back to our cabin. So we got all the way down the hills and go to the lake before we finally decide to look back up to the mine. To our dismay, we see the light, still bobbing back and forth and coming down the hill behind us. We hurried over to the end of this small man-made lake and crossed the creek via a small dam. Then we headed straight to the cabin. Now, this cabin was a converted railroad car which was left there back in the 1890s or something. The family who our family bought it from moved in and converted it into a living space. One side was a bedroom area, the other side was a living area with a cooking furnace or fireplace towards the far back corner. The old car had been a passenger car, so it had viewing windows on the sides and an entrance on either side. The viewing windows were easy to look out from the seating in the car, but they were high above the ground outside. So we come running down to the cabin, we get inside, and we immediately shut off our lantern and look back the way that we came. Again though, even though it's night, it's pretty bright out with the new snow and the full moon, so much so that our cabin is still very well lit. As we're looking at the window, we see the light head around the far side of the small hills, above the lake, and then drop out of view. We keep watching out the window until the light reappeared, and it was tracing its way in its slow bobbing fashion around the far side of the lake towards the dam crossing. And as soon as we saw the light come back into view, we all sat down below the windows. I sat by the furnace and my 2 friends sat next to each other, across the car from me with their backs to the front door. My other friend sat at the back of the car near the bedroom. We sat on the floor and waited as the bobbing light got closer and closer, occasionally shining towards our window. All of a sudden, the bobbing light gleams through one of the windows on the side of the car, and now is obviously very bright, blindingly bright in fact, as if a floodlight were being shone down on all 3 of us. We can't see a thing, but we suddenly hear the back screen door open and slam closed. Then we heard what sounded like heavy boots walking towards the front door. My friend with his back to the door reached up behind him and locked it, and at this point we were all completely terrified, despite the fact that all of us had firearms in our hands. In fact, I don't even think I remember I had a gun. But the boots stomped around the front door and we all saw the door handle move, which meant that someone had tried that door once, twice, and then the front screen door shut. One of the most vivid memories for me was the sound of the boots though. I still remember that heavy stepping, like clomping sound. The steps walked back around and through the window above me and to my right. I saw this silhouette, a shadow of a person's head coming through the window and showing on the floor to my left as this floodlight shone down directly on my 2 friends by the door. All I can see is the shadow, and my friend towards the back of the car doesn't have an angle out of his window, but my 2 friends by the door are looking straight out of that window and their eyes are as big as dinner plates. I'll never forget the looks on their faces, but I'm looking down at the shadow, up at the light, back to my friends and their bulging eyes and terrified expressions. And then, all of a sudden, gone. The light, the shadow, the boots, everything was just gone in an instant. And then, for the longest time, we just sort of sat there. To this day, I can't tell you how long we sat there in silence, but finally we got up the courage to walk outside to where the light had been looking at the window from. Now, there was just no reason to go to this side of the cabin. It was away from the doors, not much of a view, and on the opposite side of the lake, so we never really hung out there or even walked over there. All the same, there were footsteps leading over there in the fresh snow. Again though, this was a railroad car, so the windows were a good 7 feet off the ground from the outside. As we neared the window from which we had seen the shadow, we saw a small semicircle with absolutely no snow directly below the window. There was snow everywhere else, but right below that window, it was just pine cones, grass, and leaves and dirt, as if whatever was there had melted the snow or something. But we ran back inside and started talking about what we had just seen. And this is what my friends told us. So what they had seen throughout the window was an older man's face. He had a grizzled beard and an old miner's cap with a kerosene headlamp on the top of his helmet. The miner had raised his hand up to his lips in a shushing motion, licked his finger, and put out the light on his helmet. And that was when everything had disappeared. Well, we didn't sleep for the rest of the night, obviously, and we packed up early and we headed back. When we got back home, we spoke to my friend's family about the history of the cabin. My friend's mother had told us that his father had always told the story of a miner who had lost his life in the old Chicago mine and been buried somewhere near the mining camp back in the 1800s. That mining camp used to sit exactly where the cabin sits today, and she told us that they never found out where the miner was buried. And all I could think was, well, I think I may know now. I personally think that he was laid directly underneath the corner of the cabin, directly beneath that window where we had seen the perfect semicircle in the snow. The next day, too, I swear to you that this is what we did. We hiked up to the old Chicago mine, and we actually apologized. We apologized for shooting at the miner and for disturbing his work and his resting place, and after that, we just left. We've all been back to that cabin many times throughout our lives now, and we've never heard another sound or saw another strange sight. And honestly, it's just like camping in the woods again. So this happened about 4 or 5 years ago when I was still living at my parents' house. I had almost fallen asleep when I felt like I needed to go for a pee. As I was gathering strength to get up and go to the bathroom, I heard a voice just outside of my bedroom saying, "Well, what are you doing?" The voice sounded a bit like my mum, so I answered, "I have to go to the bathroom." Immediately after that, I got a weird feeling that something was just a bit off. My parents' bedroom is down the hall, and I would have heard her walking over since my door was ajar. I got up and I opened the door all the way, but nobody was there. Where I was standing, I could see straight down the hall, and the door to my parents' bedroom was completely shut. I also checked the door to my sister's room, which was adjacent to mine, but it was shut as well. For a few minutes, I just sort of stood there completely frozen in place, before I finally went to the bathroom and back to my room. Needless to say, though, I had quite a hard time falling asleep after that. When I woke up the next morning as well, I asked my mum if she had been up last night, but she said no. I also asked my sister if she had heard anything, but she had slept through the night as well. This happened a few years back. In my spring break senior year of high school, I was hiking part of the long trail in AT, which goes south from Glastonbury to Bennington. It was the usual very cold nights, warm muddy days Vermont usually has in spring, so pretty fun to hike in. I was going to take a day to rest my feet, go swimming in a pond and cool off, so I took a detour onto the Bald Mountain Trail. I got to my campsite around 5, and the sun was setting, so I set up my hammock and rain tarp and made a fire. I made some Mountain House beef stroganoff and decided to just lay down and watch the fire for a bit. Now, I hadn't seen anyone since before noon, which is unusual because it's a pretty well-travelled section of the trail. And all of a sudden, I started to get really uneasy, and it definitely felt like someone was watching me from a distance. I ended up sitting with my back against a maple, facing the fire and holding my camp knife. A few hours later, maybe 9 or 10-ish, I heard a really loud crash in the woods, like a plane falling out of the sky sort of crash, or a freight train right next to me, and then just dead silence. No wind, no leaves, no owls, just dead quiet. I remember getting really uncomfortable and shouting out to see if anyone was there, but I just started hearing a really subtle sort of droning noise, like a key being rubbed on a bass string or a radio static, but super low pitched. I didn't sleep at all that night, and I just watched the moon go really slowly over the sky, and the sound eventually got quieter as it got lighter outside. When I could see well enough to walk, I picked up my gear and I just sprinted back to the main trail and found some people up early and hiked with them all the way back. So I was 15 years old at the time, and I was playing airsoft in a super deep thicket of woods behind my house with 3 other friends. It was right on the brink of dusk and had started to rain a fair amount, but we were super familiar with these woods, so we thought anyway, so we didn't pay much mind to the lack of daylight or rain. After splitting up into one of 2 groups, we agreed that one team or 2 would go into the thick of the woods, where we'd built numerous foxholes and trenches to defend, while the other team stuck to the less wooded area of the trail that worked its way through these woods. Well, I was on the latter team, so we started making our rounds up and down the trail to try and bring them out of the woods for a sort of better angle of engagement. I had actually brought night vision goggles. We took airsoft a bit seriously, and was ahead of my partner on the trail, surveying the area, since we did know that some potentially aggressive wildlife did live out there, like coyotes and wild hogs and stuff like that. And well, after walking maybe 200 or 300 feet, I would say, into the woods, I noticed some really strange movement ahead of us on the trail, at maybe 400 feet past the trail entrance now. Whatever it was, too, it's big, like really big, at least 6 foot in stature. I immediately let my buddy know to hold tight so that I could study it a little more before it noticed us. But the weirdest thing about it all, I noticed that it was bipedal once it ran into the woods, right in the direction of our other team as well. Well, we hauled ass straight out of there. I mean, we ran like I've never run before, and I was a pudgy 15-year-old kid at the time. Once we finally got out of the field, clearing right before the trail entrance, we started scrambling for our radios and breath so that we can get to the other frequency and tell them to get the heck out of Dodge. Well, say no more, because minutes later, our other 2 buddies came rushing out of there with urgency that I didn't know that they even had. To say that their faces were as white as a ghost and that they were terrified wouldn't be doing it justice either. Once they finally were able to choke out a sentence, though, we were informed that not even minutes after my partner and I's encounter on the trail, that they had been in a foxhole maybe 300 to 400 feet away, listening and looking for us. Only, they had an encounter with our cryptid friend as well. And one of them had something, what I can only assume was this unknown creature, breathe down his neck as he sat faced away from it in the foxhole. He said that he didn't get to see it, but he could certainly feel just how big it was behind him. And not even seconds after he squeezes their experience out, we hear the most guttural, nerve-grating screech come from the woods that, to this day, I have not felt a fear remotely close to, as well as not even having a chance to identify it. We did go back to the woods the next day to see if we could find anything strange, and we did. Deer, and I mean lots and lots of just mangled deer after deer after deer, at least 5 of them in maybe a mile radius. That's what we could find anyway. We left after seeing that, and while we did keep playing airsoft at that same location, for many more months in fact, until I'd eventually moved from my childhood home, we never went back after dark past that day though. So I'm a 24-year-old lad living in the UK. I work as a pharmacist at a hospital, and I usually do night shifts. My workplace is just a few lots away from home, so I just walk every night. But a few months ago, while I was on my way to work at around midnight, a car stopped in front of me and rolled down his window. The guy inside was wearing a scrub suit, so I'm assuming that he was a nurse, had dark hair, chubby, and was probably around my age. "Hey, where you heading? Let me drive you to work." I politely declined. The guy looked harmless, and I guess being polite wouldn't hurt. He looked pretty normal, but there was just something in his eyes that unsettled me. He didn't go away after that as well, and kept on insisting to drive me to work. But that's when I snapped and I told him that I was waiting for my boyfriend, which isn't true because my boyfriend is in the US, miles away from me. He seemed to believe it though, and then just drove away. Days go by though, when I get a chat request. I try to check the profile and saw that it was that same creepy lad offering a ride to me to work. How he got my name, I have no idea. But I didn't pay his chat any attention, and I just went on with my pretty busy life. 2 days after that, I got another message from him saying, "You were smiling earlier. You look cute." After reading that message, it felt like I'd been splashed with an ice-cold bucket of water. Was he at the hospital? I didn't want to know, so I told him to stay away and F off. Days passed again, and I've almost forgotten about this guy when I saw him standing in the hallway looking at me while I was exiting the room doing rounds. He tried to approach, but I just sort of beelined my way to the other hallway and went back to the pharmacy. But that was when I started freaking out and I told my boyfriend. He advised me to just drive to work instead of walking, and I did right after that night. I also blocked him to avoid any unwanted future creepy messages, and so far I haven't seen him in months. And honestly, I would like to keep it that way. This happened about 5 years ago. I was working at a translation company based here where I live. It was a 7-story building, and that day I went for lunch break and grabbed my phone. It was an old phone with no smartphone tech, just calls and texts. And I finished my lunch and took the elevator to the 7th floor. And inside of it, I got a phone call. I look at the screen and I see this weird phone number with like 20 or more digits. I decide to answer. There was a lot of static and white noise on the line, but it was a woman, and I understand everything that she said. But this is how the call went. "Hello? Hello? Who's this?" "Isaac? Isaac? Isaac?" That's my name. Yes? Who's calling?" "Isaac, the angel is going to die." "Who? Who's going to die?" "Isaac, the angel, she's going to die." The call ended here. There was a lot of static, and it just sort of dropped out. It really freaked me out a lot too, because, well, my niece's nickname was Angelita, which means little angel. She was born with Down syndrome and a really bad heart condition that made life for her really hard during the 2 years that she was with us. And that day, she was actually scheduled for heart surgery at the main hospital here. We'd actually made a GoFundMe campaign for her, and lots of people helped, specifically from the US. That night, she went to surgery, and it was all okay. Doctors were taking care of her, and everything was looking good. But the next day is when she had complications and was moved to the ICU. The whole family was at home too when we got the terrible news that her heart had stopped and she unfortunately passed away. Our whole world really crumbled, and I was stuck with depression for about a year after it. To this day, I really have no idea who called me that day. My mum had always told me that I was gifted. I could always feel energies. I had dreams of things as well that would come to pass, and I wouldn't say that I'm a medium or anything. I mean, I've never communicated with anything on the other side. More so that I just sort of attracted them. We hopped apartments too a lot when I was younger, and no matter where we went, something would immediately find me. I'd have reoccurring nightmares, see figures, I'd be scratched, all sorts of stuff. I guess you could say that spirits like to pick on me, maybe. Another random fact that will come into play later as well is that I had bright blue eyes like my mum. So, We moved into this apartment and things immediately went very, very poorly. I had a dream that lasted only seconds. I was in a bright white room and there was this beast on the ceiling and it looked into my eyes and just roared. It was incredibly loud too, and I woke up and my mum and her boyfriend at the time had rushed into my aid because they heard me let out a scream that sounded like a deep full-grown man scream and not a prepubescent boy's. My eyes turned hazel with brown splotches and have been that way ever since. I was obviously terrified and we moved me into my big brother's room after that. But that night I felt a presence and opened my eyes and I saw a shadowy figure reach out and try and grab me. I immediately sprinted out of the room too, and I slept next to my mum on the couch in the living room from then on. But I always felt just watched from the hallway leading to my bedroom. Another thing that happened too was when I was laying in bed with my mum and her boyfriend, she looked up and saw this little girl in a petticoat standing in the hallway. He saw it too as well. I was actually asleep at the time, and I only knew this because they told me years later. Anyhow, everyone was being terrorized for months, and eventually we had just had enough. But we hired someone to come in, and she immediately detected a demonic presence. She had informed us that the building used to be a medical waste facility, and they'd dispose of and store blood in the basement, that sort of thing. My mum has told me since that she was actually able to confirm this detail, but to be truthful, I never asked how. Thinking about and speaking out this incident, though, brings me just terrible feelings, I must admit. Anyway, she blessed the place, and it didn't really do anything. We tried writing a scripture on the wall in this sort of highlighter stuff that could only be seen in UV light. We put up some crosses and that sort of thing, but it really just ticked it off even more. We eventually just moved out, and my mum spoke clearly as we left and said, "We're leaving, you're not allowed to follow us." And strangely enough, I've never had another experience with a spirit ever since then. A friend of mine that says that she's a medium, I'm not sure what I believe about this sort of thing, told me that maybe God or maybe a spirit, maybe myself even, walled myself off spiritually from my gift. I don't know about all of that, but when I think about all this, I must admit that it really upsets me. I'm 20 now, but this was easily the most turbulent time of my life. But I figured that it would intrigue some of you here, so feel free to ask me anything in the comment section below if you would like. Or maybe even add some insight or advice into my situation, as I'm definitely uninformed and ignorant about these sort of things, and I would appreciate the feedback. This happened back in 2004 in northern Wisconsin. I was 16 at the time and out deer hunting with my dad and a friend of his, Frank. I do remember this day like it was yesterday. The dialogue isn't word for word, obviously, but the ideas of it are 100% accurate, of that I'm sure. As a side note too, it was only one day after that 8 people were shot less than 2 hours away. So my dad and I had a few different stands over an area of maybe 3/4 of a square mile, I would say. He had been hunting there for at least 10 years, and I'd been going with him since I was about 5. Up until I was 12, legal age to hunt with a rifle, I'd just been tagging along mostly. This particular morning, we walked up to my stand first. It was about 5 a.m. or so still pretty dark outside. I got situated, and my dad and Frank went off to our other 2 stands over a ridge, maybe another 500 or 600 yards off. Sitting there in the dark is always a little bit eerie, I'll admit. But not long after my dad and Frank left, I see a flashlight from the general direction of where they headed, maybe 200 yards away, roughly moving in my direction. I figured that they forgot something from the truck or something, so I radioed to see what they were doing. We're sitting in my stand. Frank's about to head off to the other one," he says. Obviously, then, this flashlight is somebody else. This isn't super uncommon, and it really isn't a big deal. I mean, those woods get pretty crowded sometimes, and there's a spot to park in that general direction anyway. So I turn on my light so the other hunter can see that there's somebody there, and he stops. I see the light turn, and and just go a different direction. No big deal, and I end up dozing off while it's still dark out. When I wake up though, the sun is up. It's around 8 a.m. and I sit there for a bit. I radio my dad to see if he's heard or seen anything moving. Nothing yet. A couple of gunshots off in the distance is all. I get up and go for a slow little walk to get my blood moving for a bit. Not far, maybe 30 yards out and back, trying not to make a sound. Then I come back to my stand and sit down and take a real good look around. Nothing really going on. When I finally look out to my left, where I had seen the flashlight before, and I see orange. For anyone unfamiliar, hunters have to wear blaze orange during gun season. I radioed my dad and Frank to see if either one of them were moving around, and Dad says no. I hear nothing from Frank, so I grab the binoculars out of my backpack to see if it's Frank. And it's definitely not Frank. And this guy is looking directly at me through his scope, rifle aimed directly at me. This is a huge no-no as well. The massive rule that we all learn in hunter's education is never point your rifle at something that you don't intend to shoot. Dumb people still do it though. It's few and far between, but it does happen. And this is why normal people use binoculars. My first thought was, what an idiot. The thing is, though, is that even with me looking at him, he doesn't put his gun down. Now I'm starting to panic a little bit, thinking that I'm going to be the next hunting murder victim. So I slowly grab my rifle, get up, stand behind as many trees as I can, and walk down a little path to the side of my stand. My stand is on this kind of little knoll on the side of a much larger hill. I radio my dad, tell him what's up. He tells me to sit tight and stay out of sight. Obviously, as a 16-year-old, I couldn't do that, and I had to keep looking. And every time I looked, the guy was still aiming in my direction, but was always standing in a different spot. Like, I would look, go back to hiding, look again, and he would be like 30 yards from where he was last time. About 10 minutes of this goes by when my dad radios me, and he says, "How you doing, bud?" Looking back, he was very obviously trying to keep me calm. At the time, I thought that he just wasn't taking me seriously. So I said, he's still there, but he keeps moving. I don't know what his problem is." Dad told me to just keep hidden and he'll figure it out, that he'll be coming up near him in a minute or two. And that was when I heard the shot. I lost it instantly as well, trying to get a hold of my dad. Did he just get shot? Where is he? Did he have to shoot the guy? What the heck is going on? I sat there too for maybe like 2 or 3 minutes that felt like hours. And then, "Alright son, come on out and head toward my stand." I peek out over the little knoll that I was hiding behind and see my dad waving from along the ridge that the random guy had been on. I make the trek on over to him to see what happened. Turns out that Frank was feeling a little restless and took a little stroll, and ended up on the other side of that particular ridge the stranger was on, not knowing that he was there. He had actually knocked his radio battery loose while he was getting situated earlier in the morning, and had no idea that anything was even going on. The shot that I heard was actually Frank shooting a deer. But Dad said that as soon as Frank shot, the guy walked off away from us toward the logging road. We helped Frank out with his deer, but we decided to call it an early day after that. Although I was extremely nervous for the rest of the week, it did go on with no other incidences, which, for me, was good. A couple of years ago, I was sitting in my bedroom around, I'd say 8ish p.m, down near my university, and I was searching the internet, and I got a FaceTime call from a number that I didn't recognize, but I answered it anyway because I figured that it was just a random person, and I would grab my roommate, and we would just start a convo with some random person somewhere in the world. Anyways, I answered the FaceTime call to a very, very dark room. At first, I only managed to see what looked like to be a blanket hung up over the window behind them. It was sunny where they were because you could see the sun peeking in from around the edges of the blanket and in a sort of transom window above the blanket. So I proceeded to say hello 2 or 3 times with nobody answering. Finally, though, someone appeared from the bottom of the screen, and I kid you not, it was like literally me. I just kind of stared at them for a split second in shock and awe before sort of waving at them. As soon as I waved too, the other person on the other end mimicked my wave at the exact same time in the exact same motion. I freaked out at that point, and I just shut off my computer immediately after that. I didn't receive another FaceTime call from that random number then or ever since. But my question is, could that possibly have been a FaceTime from myself from another dimension? I know that sounds weird, but I'm not lying to you when I say that it was me. Like, it was literally me. Also, it was nighttime where I was, and clearly daytime where he was. And the waving of the hand at the exact same time and speed and mannerism, I don't know. I don't know what it was, but it still creeps me out to this day, for sure. So this happened about 4 days ago now. My family lives on a farm, so we have a large amount of land, and we're off a sort of state road with a horseshoe-shaped driveway. We had a dump trailer as well that sits in our yard, just because we don't have anywhere else to put it. And due to this whole self-quarantine thing, I'm home with my younger brother. I hear honking outside, and at the window I can see just a white vehicle. But I'm sitting there, and the vehicle is just sort of honking as if they're waiting for someone to come out. This made me a bit uncomfortable. I mean, the fact that somebody just decided to sit there and honk, and didn't want to go and even look for fear of the possibility of being seen or anything. But of course, younger siblings, being as they are, was quite oblivious to how creepy this actually was, and decided to walk up to the door in plain sight of the stranger's vehicle. Me, though, not feeling safe with just sitting there and letting my brother talk to some stranger who was sitting in the driveway, finally get up to talk to them. Obviously, I was very uncomfortable with it all. Not in the way that was like, I don't want to get sick. More of a way that there's a stranger who is honking at my door. In some sort of hindsight, though, I guess you could say that this whole thing may have been about the virus, in some regards anyway. But other factors do play in. So, there were 2 men in this white truck, and the one who spoke to me was in the passenger seat. The driver seemed quite nervous. Every time I refused to give him any information, he ended up starting the vehicle, and his friend had to keep insisting to keep talking, which led him in this sort of cycle of turning his truck on and off again. The first thing that I took note of, though, is that this guy had a very heavy accent, which I still can't quite pin. The best guesstimation I would have is maybe something European. He's asking about the dump trailer in my yard, if it's for sale, which I say no, it's not. He then asks if anybody else is home that he could talk to. I didn't hear exactly who he wanted, since his friend had turned the engine on again, but my best guess is that either a husband or my father, as he kept looking about, telling him to have him call. And well, I'm not married and my father was at work, so I said no, and that if he really wanted to see someone, that he would have to come back at a later time. Then he insisted on giving his number. Still refusing to leave the vehicle while I was saying no. There was no point in getting his number, as the trailer wasn't even for sale, and anyone else in my household would echo the exact same thing anyway. But he insists that I get some paper or something to write down his number. He has me come close to write down his number, where I notice the next thing. His number. His area code was Massachusetts number, and we're in Pennsylvania. Now, too, he has me get real close, like right up to the window, which completely throws the whole distance thing out. Apparently, they just didn't want to get out of the vehicle, which is what really made me uncomfortable as well. I was too afraid to go back into my house. I didn't truly want to irritate these people and turn my back by refusing, so I just followed what they asked me to do to get them the heck out of the driveway, ASAP. And eventually the nervous guy just says, "Let's go." I told my parents all of this once they had gotten home. Gave them the number, which they didn't call, obviously, because it all seemed really suspicious. My dad then decided to pull out a gun for me to keep nearby, just in case somebody broke into the house because of this encounter. And as my father said when I told him why they had stopped in the first place, if that trailer was for sale, then there would be a for sale sign on it. So, why the heck were they there? When I was 13 years old, my family was actually robbed, unfortunately, by my mum's ex-best friend. But before robbing us, they had broken in multiple times. One time they left the front door open, in fact, and another, my mother opened the laundry room door, and as she did, the back door closed. But having these experiences, we eventually changed the locks and made sure that we locked the doors at night, and also armed the home alarm. But the following year, the events in this story happened. For context too, my family lived in a pretty bad area. People had been robbed, and some people had even been assaulted or even jumped, my brother included. But my father is a truck driver as well, so my mother, brother, and I were usually alone there. My mum is someone who really enjoys watching the ID channel on TV. In fact, my town was once featured on one of the ID channel shows. Our town has such a huge crime rate that a human trafficking ring was busted, and my mum's ex-best friend knew someone that was busted apparently. This city that I live in is one of the most dangerous in the country, and just yesterday we drove past a car dump. Earlier in the year also we've called the cops twice, and once because we'd heard someone in the backyard, and another because we heard gunshots. But one night my brother was asleep in the living room, I was in my room, and my mother was in her bedroom. I was on my phone at like 1 a.m. because insomnia sucks. When suddenly I heard the doorbell being rang frantically. My mum is a pretty light sleeper, so she got up and went to the front door. She looked through the peephole at the door, and I walked out as she was standing on her tippy toes, looking at the front door. She's like 5 foot tall, which roughly converted into centimeters is like 150 centimeters tall. She was speaking to the guy behind the door. I heard a muffled guy's voice say, "Hey, my car broke down and I need to use your phone." My mum cleverly replied, "I'm sorry, but we don't actually have a phone." She grabbed her phone after saying that. The man insisted and tried to open the door at one point. He got angry because it was locked and started shouting. I went to my brother and woke him up, and I told him to be quieter, and we ran to the bathroom. My mum eventually joined us, and we hid in the bathroom together, just sort of holding on to each other. It felt like a lifetime in that bathroom, but my mother was on the phone with 911 the entire time. I was making sure that my brother remained quiet. When my mum told the cops that we were there, she made sure that when she heard them knocking that it was them. She gave her statement, and I couldn't hear it all because my brother and I were in the bathroom together. But my mum told us that we could come out, and I immediately called my dad in tears. He answered, and I was crying so hard that my dad couldn't understand me, so I gave the phone to my mum. A while later, though, the cops came back and told my mother that they had actually caught the guy that my mum described, and he was playing on his phone and he didn't have a car, which means that his intentions were probably to break in and rob us, or maybe even worse. I think that my mum watching the ID channel may have just saved our lives that night. I moved in with my boyfriend over 2.5 years ago into a house that he had only lived in for a few months before I joined. Living there, it was easy to tell that there was heavy energy, especially in the basement. I've always known that there was a ghost in the house, and when strange noises began happening, it wasn't much of a surprise, really. Now, the floor plan of the house is a little strange, so please bear with me. The door to the basement is located in the downstairs bathroom. The bathroom obviously wasn't always a bathroom, and that's why it was located as a sort of shoulder room to the kitchen. I'm hoping that makes sense. We always made jokes about the ghost, but it never made moves to harm us in any way. My boyfriend would slightly disagree and bring up the time that he was going to the restroom and the door opened on its own. Also, every now and again, usually at night, the spirit would inhabit the kitchen and make noises in there. On one occasion, just to sort of show my friends, I brought them into the basement, and they all agreed that they could feel the spirit as well. After returning back upstairs, a few of my friends claimed that they left uneasy, headache, nausea, etc., and out of anger, I confined the spirit to the basement. I practiced witchcraft. After that, though, the spirit sort of retreated, but sometime later, I insisted that the spirit leave the house, and to our surprise, it did. For months, we hadn't had any issue, and we felt no presence. But something has come into our home once again, more active than the last one as well. For the last month, noises have started again, even to the point where I swear that I think I'm hearing talking. Multiple members of the witchcraft community have agreed that the energy of the world is off, and some have even gone so far as to claim that there's been a rip in the veil. Whether you believe in that type of stuff is up to you, but I give you the information nonetheless. But this entity, whatever it is different. I don't feel its presence often, nor do I understand what it is. But one of my close friends has even witnessed what it has done before. She had come over to my house, and while I was talking, I had heard, in the downstairs bathroom, a glass jar that was sitting on the porcelain toilet move. We had stayed silent for a few moments before I turned and asked if she had heard it. She said yes. As of the moment that I'm writing this, it's 5 a.m. and I'm laying in bed with my boyfriend in our pitch-black house. He's asleep. I was listening to music on my phone, and during a pause when there was no music playing, from all the way upstairs, I hear the doorknob of the laundry room door, located in the kitchen, turn back and forth violently. It's an unmistakable sound. I'm pretty rattled about it as well, but it's not worth waking my boyfriend up for. At least, not yet. But I worry about what this new thing is, or what it might be. Do any of you guys have any advice or any comments? Because they're welcome.